Malcolm H. Kerr, Carnegie Middle East. Oh, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Thank you for joining us today to discuss From Conflict to Crisis, understanding Lebanon's humanitarian needs and possibly a bit about the way forward. Despite the horrible circumstances, I'm delighted to welcome with me today His Excellency Dr. Nasser Yassin, who is the Minister of Environment for Lebanon, but also the coordinator for Lebanon's National Crisis team. Lebanon, as you all know, has been profoundly affected by the ongoing conflict. This has been a conflict for the past year, but it suddenly escalated over the past month with a horrific toll not only on the lives of Lebanese. More than 2,700 have been killed over the past year, more than 11,500 injured, but we're also seeing horrific levels of destruction in cities and towns across Lebanon, in the south, in Beirut, in the Beqaa, and many other parts of Lebanon. And it is not just about the costs, but also the potential repercussions. Your Excellency, Dr. Yassin, let me begin with a question, which is, given the catastrophic levels of destruction as a result of Israeli bombardments and the unprecedented number of displaced, we're talking about close to 1.2 million people who have been displaced over, well, maybe 100,000 for a year. And then over the past month, that number surged suddenly to 20% of Lebanon's population. Can you talk to us a little bit about the immediate priorities of the National Emergency Committee for managing Lebanon's humanitarian crisis, and walk us through some of the repercussions of this conflict and what is needed at this point?
Thank you, Dr. Maha, for hosting this event and organizing it. I think it's very important to show the situation, discuss it, and even with the ongoing catastrophe and ongoing war and hostilities and aggression, we need to discuss as well how to deal with the immediate life-saving needs, but also to discuss the day after. We haven't had the time so far because we've been running to provide the life-saving assistance for people, and displacement continues, but we still need to discuss the day after. And I think this is the right forum and the right panel and the right center to discuss these. So, it wasn't a matter of months that we saw more than 1.2 million. It was a matter of days, actually. Between the evening of 23rd of September and 27th of September, in the course of 4 days, we saw more than 1 million people being displaced. This is, by the scale and the speed and the intensity of it, this resembles, or it's like having an earthquake. When 20 or 25% of the population move from one place to the other, this is like a real earthquake. And this is actually what happened. So the immediate needs were to provide shelter, and we immediately, working with the different ministries, the different crisis cells, we started opening mostly schools, but eventually any available building to host people, and this reached around 250,000 individuals or displaced persons, around 50,000 families in collective shelter. But the majority have moved to friends, to renting, to living with family members. And this is another challenge for the government and for the humanitarian system to cater for those. So the immediate challenges were in the first few days and first couple of weeks, but they remain to provide a shelter, to provide the basic needs, to provide food. And this has been ongoing. It's now going okay with the joint response system we created with the UN agencies. We started this actually from day one, and we knew that we are under-resourced financially, but also human resources at the level of the administration and public sector to undertake this huge, response. And now the main focus is actually going on four main points. First is winterization. Lebanon is a mountainous region. Beqaa can get very cold as well. So all the focus for the last few days or the last couple of weeks has been to really be prepared for the winter season, knowing that this is going to be, unfortunately and sadly, with the silence of the international community and some of the major powers, this was going to be protracted until winter. So we're working on preparing for the winter on different things. I might go into details if you wish, but to provide fuel, but also provide the personal needs for IDPs and displaced individuals and families, but also to weatherproof the schools and collective shelter that are never built to host people actually. So this is another challenge. But winterization is key, and its cost is in the range of $70 million that we would need to mobilize, whether partly through government, and we're going to provide fuel for the collective shelter and those who are in the altitude above 300, around 540 of them. And of course, we're working with the UN agencies and other donors to provide the other needs. So this is on the winter. The second one is about the water and sanitation and hygiene. And again, schools and collective shelter were not built or designed to host this number of people. So UNICEF has been a major partner in this. We're fixing 430 schools, but we want to fix another 600. So we're running again in getting funds and getting the support to fix the other schools, meaning showers, basic hygiene, and so on. Thirdly, the food has been designed to be distributed through the World Food Program. Almost 200,000 meals are distributed every day, going back to saying this is like an earthquake. Usually, you do these in major humanitarian and natural disasters, but we're moving to support what we call communal kitchens that are now in different areas in different regions. And the fourth one that's becoming increasingly challenging is how to get aid to the hard to reach areas. First in the south, Hasbaya, Marjayoun, Ramesh, and Nabatiye, whoever have stayed in Nabatiye, but also in Hasbaya, Ramesh, and some parts of Marjayoun, people are still there. So how to plan the humanitarian convoys into these areas. It's becoming increasingly difficult to send convoys. But now Baalbek and Hermel, which actually last week or 10 days ago, one of the humanitarian convoys was hit by an airstrike or nearby, and one driver or two drivers were injured. Although the convoy is going by whatever they say as the standards for this, open Red Cross flags to clear it through the different channels within the UN and the Lebanese army, but still it got hit. So this is a major challenge now to get the assistance to the hard to reach areas, whether in the south or Baalbek al Hermel. I'm just putting out some of the immediate needs, what we call life saving at this stage. But there are additional challenges into providing services, and this is what we discussed in Paris last week.
That's what I wanted to ask you in terms of
how,
the
how to provide the basic services with this major aggression happening, but the major displacement of 20 to 25% of the population moving from one place to the other for an already fragile system, whether health, social, basic services. Give you an example. Water needs to be redistributed altogether to where 50% of the population have moved now to Beirut and southern part of Mount Lebanon. So you need to redesign the whole distribution of water for an already fragile and weakened system of water distribution. Just to give an example of solid waste for that matter, or electricity, or healthcare, and then education, given all the situation that 600 of the collective shelters are public schools. So, the challenges are immense. And the humanitarian system and the whole architecture of humanitarian response is not designed to keep running after the aggressive nature of, and this actually very aggressive nature of the hostilities and attacks we're facing every day. So first and foremost, if we want to step back after I explained the challenges and in an overview of these challenges, we really need, and to the international community, the major players in the global scene, to be brave enough and stop this war. This is first and foremost. If we continue running after the what looks like professionalizing the herbicide and genocide by the different tweets and so on, uh, this is endless. This is a futile thing. We're running after a war machine and a killing machine. This has to stop, and then we cater for people who can't go back now for many reasons, including that their villages and towns were wiped out and were blown up,
We'll
and then we work on the early recovery and the stabilization and later the reconstruction.
we'll get to that in a second, but I mean, obviously, part of what the challenges that you're facing is that this is a constantly shifting war. It's not like you have a stable war front where you know that it's at the border between this, Lebanon and Israel. It's actually today there was an evacuation order issued by the Israeli army to the entire city of Baalbek. We're talking more than 100,000 inhabitants, and I don't know that if that includes also people who've been displaced to Baalbek. Not to mention that it's an UNESCO heritage site, but that's a different story. So it's a war where you're constantly chasing. It has very moving boundaries and moving areas, and it feels like nowhere is safe in Lebanon anymore. Any area can be targeted, and I think this is also partly what's triggering this mass population movements from one place to the other. People don't know where to go. But in this context, I wanted to ask you, we've been hearing there have been a lot of emerging reports about tensions with host communities. There's obviously a competition over resources, the overload on an infrastructure that already was dilapidated before all of this started, and that it is simply not capable of handling the mass influx of people. How are you worried? How worried are you about internal strife? What is being done to address this, if anything? What can be done at this point?
Um, I mean, there are, of course, certain incidents, and sometimes the social media fuels, these tensions. And tensions in Lebanon have been existing. I mean, this is not new. Communal tension, stereotypes against different communities, social media and Twitter have been, full of these uh, of these statements and so on. But I think there's more than 1 million people who have moved from their places of residence of origin to another place. So it's expected that there will be some tension here and there, but by and large, it has been okay actually. Given the scale of it,
Mm.
the scale is huge. I mean, 20, as you mentioned, 20 or 25% of the population moving from one place to the other is not a simple undertaking for anyone, for any nation. Imagine the US 70 million people moving from one place to the other. Just give this in the context of it, and you can
In four
imagine
days. In
all
four
the
days.
4 days, and you can imagine the repercussions. Florida had something, right? A natural disaster, I think, a couple of weeks ago.
It was a
Uh,
hurricane.
Hurricane. So I mean, as a matter of fact, things have been largely contained in the first few days, and still we've seen a fantastic, communal initiatives or community initiatives for people to help the displaced and to host them and to support them. And it continues, as a matter of fact, in many parts of the country with different political and communal backgrounds. It's continuing. So I'm not undermining or discounting any tension, and I'm not saying that everything is beautiful. I mean, there's a lot of challenges, particularly if you want to look into some private buildings that people are using, private schools that displaced have been hosted in them, and so on. But we are in continuous dialogue with everybody to reduce any tension, to contain it, but also to have law and order, to have the uniformed Lebanese uniforms, army, police, municipalities, maintaining law and order, to have the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Social Affairs being present, always present in the collective shelter. Most of them are schools or educational buildings or institutions. That the fear is in if this is protracted, and definitely this would open up a lot of the of communal tension or challenges around not only competition over resources, but competition over parking spot in Beirut. So I'm not making it,
No, it's true.
but it is, as a matter of fact, as an example, maybe metaphorically speaking, this is what people are showing at the surface of it. So we really need to always maintain communal relations, intercommunal relations, and containing any tension that could emerge here and there.
Just on this issue, because you've mentioned education several times, and one big issue that has repeatedly come up is the concern with the lost generation. I mean, we're looking at now, schools all over the south and the Beqaa are out of order. Obviously, children cannot go to school. And then in Beirut, and other across Lebanon, many of the public schools are now occupied by, are housing displaced populations. So are there plans today to try and deal with that, to make sure that we don't have children, there isn't a split between children who go to private schools and who are still able to continue with their education, and public schools children who are unable to continue with their education?
I mean, you rightly put it, Maha. There's now a two-tier education system in Lebanon. The more fortunate ones, I would say, are going to schools in certain areas, and then those who've been displaced, or the less fortunate who usually go to the public schools, who are now outside the educational system. So this is a major challenge for the Ministry of Education, for the government, and for society. Now, we've been working on, the Ministry of Education and the government working on having what we call educational centers, where different shifts for different children to go there. Online is very challenging for people who have been displaced, or it's not so straightforward for someone, or 10 or 15 people now in one room, a previous classroom, to have an online and hybrid system or a distance learning. So, but you've seen what happened today in Baalbek. So while the Ministry of Education have been telling us we need to free some schools from being a collective shelter, to allow this idea of having educational centers where different kids displaced or in the community to come to them in different shifts, 1, 2, or 3 shifts. We're running now to open more collective shelter for the tens of thousands of people who were displaced from the city of Baalbek, and yesterday from Zahrani, and the day before from Tir. So, as you rightly put it, this is a moving boundaries, and we'll continue to run to have more and more collective shelter. So whenever you think of kind of an emergency plan for certain sectors, you're faced with an intensified aggression in new areas and new cities and new places. And then you have to go back to square one and plan again how to deal with the educational system. It's I think, one of the biggest challenges given the current intensity And the scale of the aggression on Lebanon and the war on Lebanon is to deal with education. As you rightly put, we fear a lost generation, and we fear that significant a proportion of people who felt in the last before the war last year that things are starting to stabilize to a certain degree, particularly among the middle classes, that they can actually stay in the country. And now this is the risk that they will leave, and many of them have left actually, and now they're maybe doing hybrid or online or distance from abroad. But if this continues, many middle class families even are going to leave. So lost generation from those displaced from the south, from Dahi, from Beqaa, lost generation of people who rely on the public sector, public education, and now middle classes who are just planning an exit from the country. This is going to be one of the major casualties of this war on Lebanon.
Just a couple more questions and then we'll move to the day after scenario. But we've also seen a deliberate targeting of the healthcare sector. I think something like 176 healthcare workers have been killed in the past year. Many hospitals are out of order now, primary healthcare clinics. Can you talk say a few words? And again, just to remind people or the audience that this was a country that was already facing significant challenges prior to all of this. So can you maybe perhaps say a few words about that, but also in terms of having come from Paris, what is the aid gap? Did the Paris conference last week convened by President Macron meet the needs of Lebanon and the expectations, or not really?
Okay. Now, on the health, I think you rightly mentioned. The attacks are intentional and deliberate on the healthcare workers. This is the same textbook that the occupied, Israeli occupied army is using in Gaza now, is using in Lebanon now. Hospitals have been, send these warnings to leave, including Sahel, others in the south, in Baalbek and other places. This is the same. My main point here, and I've been saying it several times. There is no real. There's no real position from the international community on the respect of the international humanitarian law or Geneva Convention or any international law for that matter. And now, as you mentioned, UNESCO cultural sites. This is very dangerous, and we're seeing someone with the most sophisticated war machine being waged on one of the smallest and weakest nation in the region. And all you get is these silly diplomatic terms around border exchange of border, and we need to have some deconflicting here and there, and so on and so forth. This requires a major position from the main countries who've been supporting Israel. This cannot continue this way, including the US, including Germany. I'm very transparent and very vocal on this. Funding and bankrolling this war will lead to more misery, more hatred, more bloodshed. This war has no strategic value except killing and destruction and herbicide and genocide. So this has to stop, So healthcare workers, educational institutions, children, the destruction of Nabatiyya or Tir or Baalbek or Dahi has whatsoever no strategic value. No strategic value. They're just, blowing up the city of Nabatiyya is just doing it to, put more harm and to make people feel that, at some point they need to throw in the towel. And this is, completely obnoxious by any standards. And this is what we need to always talk about. I don't think it's just the details of what's happening. There is a major war being waged by a war machine being bankrolled by international, actors, and they've been doing minimal level of diplomacy to stop this war. And I think this is what matters. Otherwise, we're just running in circles and trying to explain the repercussions of it here and there.
Can I just then ask you again? We've mentioned several times the weakness of state institutions, and I concur this war has to stop and it has to stop now. But if the weakness of state institutions prior to all of this conflict, can you maybe talk to us? I mean, in view of the economic crisis, 5 years of crisis now, what are the challenges the government is facing as a government, and how are you ensuring that aid is reaching those that it needs to reach? How are you ensuring transparency, accountability for the money that is coming in? And how are you liaising perhaps also with civil society organizations in this area?
I mean, there's no money coming into the government so far. That's to be clear from the beginning. I mean, most of the response is taking place with the UN agencies. So it's fully coordinated with the government. We even have sometimes, a steering wheel, to say it this way, but it's fully coordinated in a quite efficient and effective way. And the UN agencies have been fully collaborating with the different government institutions. We're emphasizing the role of public institutions and state institutions at the local level, from the smallest unit, municipality, to the governor, the muhafiz, to the different ministries, and to this committee that's coordinating the response on behalf of the government. Everything we do is transparent, is going through local crisis cells at the governorate or district level or municipal level, and we publish everything. Everything is published. But what we got as a committee, I mean, representing the government, has been the in-kind aid, mostly from Arab countries. And we're grateful for their support. They're sending, food parcels or non-food items, relief items that are needed, or medical supplies. And we intentionally designed the response to go through the local governors and the local authorities, and we publish everything that comes in, that comes out. We have an auditing system, and we're having a grievance system of judges to look into any issue that could emerge in the distribution of aid. We're still in need of a lot of aid, because everything we're receiving is covering mostly now people in collective shelter, who make 20 to 25% of the displaced. So we're working continuously to get more and more aid for those in collective shelter, but also residing in households, in homes, with family, with friends, and so on. We publish everything. There are portals, and we're developing even these portals and dashboard further to make them even more accessible for everybody.
Okay.
This time in Paris, and I'm gonna stop there here. In Paris, we stressed on supporting public institutions. We stressed on, as we know they're fragile, under-resourced. Sometimes government institutions have, or administration, many of them have lost their staff in the last couple of years. But this is a time where we need the public institutions to show their leadership and their presence and support to everybody, to the citizens of Lebanon and people who live in Lebanon, starting from the Lebanese armed forces, to the police, to all the line ministries who've been dealing with the current emergency situation.
Okay, just a question also on the environmental. You're the Minister of Environment, so I wanted to ask you about the environmental impact of this conflict, which right now is not being discussed. But what we do know is that, at least in the areas close to the border, Israel has used phosphorus bombs, which has basically renders agricultural land unusable for at least a decade. So can you talk to us a little bit about the environmental impact of this conflict, if you have any indications?
No, we did an assessment, the Ministry of Environment with the UNDP and later with the World Bank, on the environmental cost of the war. That's until July or August, before the recent aggression after 23rd of September. And of course, the environmental cost is huge. The use of white phosphorus was documented. We filed a complaint to the UN Security Council, and we're documenting all of the environmental violations or violations of international law and the impact on the environment. The other, I mean, we have all the figures around the meters. They are around, I think, 5 million square meters were burned using white phosphorus. This is the catastrophic in terms of forest fires and the loss of forest land and agricultural land, but also construction and demolition waste. This is another challenge that we're now assessing and getting as much as we can be prepared for this. There's a lot of funding needed to treat the construction and demolition waste, whether in south of Beirut or South Lebanon or in Baalbek. There will be more assessments on the environmental damages by looking into the soil, but this is when we'll be allowed to move our specialists into the areas that have been affected by the war.
Okay, final question, and I was going to ask about the reconstruction, but you can say if you want to say a few words. But I'd like to ask you about news that seems to be coming out in the Israeli press now, that there's some discussion around a possible end of this conflict in the coming weeks, perhaps after the American elections. Can you make any, do you have any comment on that and on the status of these discussions and whether they actually are taking place? Has the government gotten any messages on this front?
Just whatever you read in the news, but I think this is, all of these, we've been seeing this since September. A lot of these are just to deceive Lebanon and the Lebanese on a possible ceasefire. And yet what you get an evacuation for a major city in East Lebanon. If there are seriousness on a ceasefire, I think it can be as simple as this war can stop, and then we can move into discussing the process of implementing 1701. We've been very clear as a government that we are fully into the full implementation of 1701 with all its articles and components. And in Paris, we made this very clear, and the army has made its plan to deploy in South Lebanon to be the national authority, the Lebanese armed forces to be the only and sole law and order with the Lebanese police to maintain law and order in South Lebanon. But this, is a process. You cannot do it when your cities are being, destroyed day and night, and you cannot do it when your people and children are being killed. If there is serious about this, the war has to stop, and then you go into gradually implementing. And this is going to be a process. 1701 it cannot happen overnight. You need to support the army in terms of the personnel, the equipment, they need training, they need financial support, but also you need to go gradually in this implementation. And you need as well to do and start an internal dialogue in Lebanon on the implementation of 1701 and electing a president of the republic.
Minister Yassin, thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is the first of what will probably become a series of conversations as the situation develops. But thank you for taking time to joining us today for this panel. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. I think we're now Nadim and Haneen are joining. All right, now we're joined by my two colleagues also who are joining this conversation. Nadim Houry, who is the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative based in Paris and former Director of Human Rights Watch for the MENA region. And my colleague Haneen Sayed, who is a Senior Fellow at Carnegie but also a former senior development officer at the World Bank. Nadim, let me begin with you. You heard Minister Yassin, what Minister Yassin had to say about the humanitarian needs and what is happening, the challenges that the country is facing. Given your previous hat, I'd like to ask you about human rights challenges that are arising, particularly as a result of the displacement of 20 to 25% of Lebanon's population, 1.2 million people, and what prevention or what protection is urgently needed at this point. What kind of protection mechanisms are urgently needed at this point? We can't hear you, Nadim. You're muted.
Here we go. Thank you, Maha, for having me. And obviously, the main violation at this stage are the violations of international humanitarian law by through Israeli attacks. But if we talk about the situation of the displaced, I think Minister Yassin has sort of laid it out quite well, that part of the challenge today is the complexity of the situation. So if we break down that number of 1.2 million, because I think we need to understand who are these displaced to understand the challenges, the rights involved, and the protection mechanisms needed. Only about 190,000, probably a bit more right now, are what the IOM called registered IDPs. They're actually in shelters. We can count them. The ministries can work with them. They know exactly what's going in, what's not. Of those, there are about 440,000 people are estimated to actually have crossed from Lebanon to Syria. And about 70% of those numbers, so about 300,000, are Syrians who have returned. And that raises other issues I'll come back to in a second. And there are about 130,000 Lebanese nationals who exited Lebanon via Syria. And UNHCR tells us that there are about almost 20,000 Lebanese who've arrived to Iraq. So I start with these numbers just to say that the majority of people are actually out of sight. They are staying in private accommodations. The minister talked about it. A lot of people are either renting homes, staying with friends, or staying, some of them, in the streets. For those who are renting out homes, there's actually no one really regulating rent. So you might have a nice landlord, or we've seen examples where some landlords have taken advantage of the situation. But we also know that particularly vulnerable groups, notably foreigners, don't necessarily have a place to go to, and they don't have the means to actually rent. And priority in the public shelters has been to Lebanese. We've had incidents of certain foreigners, migrant workers being pushed out or not allowed to register in these shelters. And that brings out a particular vulnerability. Because we also have to remember, and I think here, particularly when Western media talks about Dahi just as a Hezbollah stronghold, I mean, Dahi is also the suburb of Beirut. It's also the part of the city, because some parts of it are cheaper to live in, has also been the part of the city that has hosted large number of migrants and refugees from Sudan, from Syria, from many other parts of the world, from Yemen, of course. So, once we have this sense, what is the biggest challenge? Obviously, the first one is safety. I think most people will be familiar with the terrible attack on Aitu and Zgharta in the north, a Christian majority village that killed at least 23 displaced, among them 12 women and children, and wounded many others. So this creates fear, right? And that's the primary right, the right to life. But this fear for the displaced has also created fear for the host communities, and that has direct impact on the rights of those displaced, because many people became afraid of hosting displaced families. So we saw municipalities requiring people to register, sending messages to residents saying, please don't take anyone in before you check in with us. But we've also seen private practices. And I think here, what people saying, look, we're happy to host women and children, but we don't want any men. We see this sort of discrimination. And can I blame individual families making these decisions? Everyone is afraid, right? But I think what we need is more clear guidance from public authorities to ensure that the displaced can be hosted in safe and durable manner, to make sure clear that, of course, people are also in financial crisis, so they may not be able to open their house for free, their homes for free, but if they're going to rent, they need to rent in a way that is reasonable and it takes into account the situation. Also, Syrian human rights groups, notably the Syrian Network for Human Rights, noted that of the returning Syrian refugees, there were arrests of at least 26 of them since September 23, when Israel's attacks on Lebanon accelerated. I think the minister, I won't go very long, but I think the minister talked a bit the issue of shelter. I think here again, the needs are much higher. So a lot of people right now are renting or are staying with friends. But how long can this be? People's savings are running out. Many of their savings are still stuck in the bank. And overcrowding, some people have opened their homes. Maybe in a few weeks, they will be less hospitable because of, their need to sort of resume their own lives. So I think that we really need to be, the right to housing is going to be important, particularly if this terrible war does not stop faster. On food, the minister talked about 200,000 meals per day. We've seen the numbers ramping up. I think the encouragement of communal kitchens is important. It also empowers local communities. But we know that food insecurity remains actually very high. This was an issue even before the current war. I mean, back in the summer of 2023, World Food Program was already at the time saying 25% of households in Lebanon are food insecure. And just not to take too long, I will just finish with 2 points. There are also the rights of particularly vulnerable populations. We think obviously of the elderly, pregnant women, babies, but actually also those with existing need for regular medical treatment. We're not seeing enough attention just because the needs are so much, but also because of the displacement situation is so complex with so many people in private spaces. The other one is the issue of mental health. These terrible, the way Israel is basically messing with the minds and terrorizing the Lebanese population with these tweets in the middle of the night, you now have to leave. We saw it today, an entire city of Al-Bak being vacated, huge mental health needs. And finally, I think you mentioned it, so I will not dwell too much on it. I think, what is the real plan here for education at this point? How do we make sure that people are not, the children don't lose yet another year? And I think we're going to need to be creative. There are other places to host the displaced. I haven't seen enough of a conversation of how can we use lands and assets, not just from the state, but also of religious wealth, right? Religious trust, be it Muslim or Christian. Why not use churches and mosques to host people? Why should we sacrifice education and schools at this point?
I think that's going to actually, you preempted my question to Haneen, because Haneen has been closely involved in the question of education. Maybe we'll come back. Thank you, Nadim, for that, and actually for that breakdown, which is incredibly important, because for us to understand not only the scale of the problem in terms of numbers, but also the breakdown and of what it means for the country, as not only as we deal with the crisis, but as we move forward. And maybe we'll come back to the issue of IHL in a bit. But Haneen, I want to turn to you now. We know that a large portion of Lebanon schools today are being used as shelters. Could you perhaps walk us through the impact this is having on, the repurposing of schools as shelters, on the future of education in the country? I know you've been involved in some initiatives on this front. Also, perhaps a bit more on what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Maha. Thank you, and thank you to Carnegie for organizing this event. So indeed, just to put some numbers, somewhere around 500 and 550,000 Lebanese students are out of school, which is 50%, given that there's about a little over a million students. We're talking about, pre-university. So that's half the population of students that are out of school. That is enormous and huge number. You also have about 45,000 teachers who are been impacted. And one thing I want to note, we keep forgetting that half of that number of students out of school are actually coming from private schools, because in areas like Dahye and the south, there were many of these smaller semi-private schools, if you will. But just to keep that in mind also. Now, they have been provided, many of those, the public schools are the ones that have been converted into shelters, as already mentioned by the minister and yourself. And something like 75% of the public schools are being used as shelter. And as we are now hearing, more and more displacement is happening, probably the government will open more of the public schools for shelter. Now, understandably, this decision, because as the minister said, this displacement was so unprecedented in terms of speed and scale. I mean, no country can handle this level of displacement so quickly. So now this is where we are. And I just want to emphasize and stress how important it is to keep the issue of education on the table from now, because there are many urgent needs, and ministers already described them: food, and now winterization, and health pandemics potentially. However, if we don't act now on education, it will literally be a lost generation, as has been mentioned. Let's not forget that Lebanon already, in the last 4 years, has had a very high level of learning loss, which has actually been measured by organizations like the World Bank. 270 days out of 600 school days have been used last 4 years. So that's a very, very large amount of learning loss. And even on the economic level, where there has been some estimates of what this means economically, we're talking about the economy losing every day of a school closure, public school closure, $3 million per day, which is per month roughly about 50 to 60 million, which is per year about 5 to 600 million. That's the kind of economic loss we're talking about from every day schools are closed. So it's very important to keep the emphasis on it. Now, what to do, and I think this is very important. Now, the Ministry of Education has put a plan with the assistance of UNESCO. It's decent in the sense that it gives the broad overall direction. But I think what's going to have to happen is implementation of this, and it will vary tremendously on the local level, because every locality has a different situation. In some areas, you can have schools that have excess capacity that they can absorb in the morning shift or create an afternoon shift. That's possible, but in other localities, they cannot. So this has to somehow be managed while guided from the top, but managed at the local level, and giving the local level, the communities, the schools with the communities, the space and flexibility to manage at that level. So first of all, I think in terms of education intervention, first is to find alternative shelter. I mean, obviously this is not going to happen overnight, but I do agree with Nadim that not enough emphasis, at least from what we hear, that the government has put in terms of finding alternative shelter, and as soon as possible. We understand the complexities of this, but that's something that it needs to be addressed. Second, as I mentioned, is to absorb or to accommodate as much as possible the students that are out of school in the formal education, so that they can at least have a hope of getting a decent education. And this means either morning shift or creating afternoon shift. Lebanon now has 10 years of experience of creating afternoon shift, which it did for the Syrian refugees. So we have a lot of experience of how to do that. Now you need to do it more, and maybe now you need to get the private schools in. Now, some people say private schools will not be interested in this. Well, this is to be seen. Some may not, some may, and incentives can be provided clearly, and this somehow has to be managed. The other thing is we're going to need to think about providing direct financial assistance to students, scholarships, because poverty has increased tremendously in the country. And not only the students that are displaced, now we have a whole set of new host communities. We've also become familiar in Lebanon using the term host communities in the context of the Syrian refugees. But now we have a whole other areas which are hosting displaced persons, in this case Lebanese, and those are also going to be impacted. And interventions, whether it be education or others, must certainly also tend to them. So also what I come to say is that financial support to communities may also be needed. There's a lot of NGOs finally on the education that are doing and are interested to do more in terms of supporting, especially out of school or what we call non-formal education programs. These are also important. Hard to get a grasp of all of them. There's many good ones and some that are really probably not doing a whole lot. But finally, let me just conclude also supporting what Nadim said. Very important to have in these programs wellness, psychosocial support, trauma for war trauma programs, because this is such a large traumatic impact on our students.
Thank you, Haneen. Actually, I wanted, you brought up the issue of financial support and increasing poverty. Before, the World Bank just put out, I think, a report a few months ago, talking about the increased levels of poverty. I think they've reached something like 45% as a result of the financial crisis. And now this has doubled, or we don't know if it's doubled, but it has increased tremendously. This is a country that historically has had very poor safety nets, very poor social protection mechanisms. So can you perhaps say a few words, please, on this issue? What can be done to scale up existing programs? Do we need to think about new programs of support for displaced Lebanese today?
Thank you, Maha. No, absolutely. I mean, I think the economic impact is going to be huge. Already we have estimates from the Lebanese Chamber of Commerce saying 80 to 90% of businesses are somehow impacted. UNDP issued a report last week saying growth will be negative, maybe around 10% this year. We're waiting for the World Bank estimates on this, but by all means, this is going to be very significant, and we know it will impact poverty, as you said, maybe double, but already in areas like Akkar, it was 70% pre this war. So you can just understand. So here, of course, a lot of programs, economic programs, would need to be put in place as part of the day after. But one immediate mechanism at the government's disposal, which they are using, but I think could even be used more and more, is the what they call Barnamij Aman, the Aman program, which is a targeted social safety net, cash transfer to poor families. This was developed in the context of the financial crisis and COVID, and has now been working quite well under the Ministry of Social Affairs and Prime Minister's Office. The beauty about this program, one, is that it's a government program, government runs it. So when we go back to what Minister Yassin was saying about working with public institutions, this is one program that is there and is really ready for donors to put more money into it. Second, it is based on a very solid technical design and implementation, transparency, efficiency. There is a social registry. Few people in Lebanon know that today at least 45% of the Lebanese population is registered in this social registry. And more can come in if the government opens the door for applications. So already the government has a very effective means by which to target people and provide them cash assistance. Cash assistance will be needed for rent, as Nadim has said, like a rental subsidy. Could be used for education, could be used for hospitalization. Absolutely, it has wide uses. So this is something that would absolutely is there, and I urge even the donors in my conversations with them is to utilize the system and put more funds into it.
No, we need to build up on what's already there and work with parts of the state that one can work with. Nadim, let me turn to you now. Well, we haven't mentioned the Syrian refugees issue. There are about 1 million refugees in Lebanon. That's one perhaps question around also rights and vulnerabilities. From what we understand, shelters are only taking in the Lebanese and not Syrian refugees. They are more under the mandate, if you like, of the UNHCR. But beyond that, do you see the situation, how do you see the situation influencing Lebanon's social fabric, the conflict, the displacement, the mass displacements, pushing people from one part of the country to the other, increasing polarization, increasing tensions? I mean, we've spoken and mentioned many of these. And what can be done to alleviate the prospects of internal strife, which I think many of us are worried about?
Thank you very much, Maha. And I just wanted to say something, just following up on what Haneen said. I think this is really an important moment to think about state building, and I will link it back to this issue of today. How can we address the issue of the weakening social fabric? This is, I mean, Lebanese society, even before the war, was reaching the limits of its coping mechanisms. This is the time really to kind of think about a universal social protection system that really takes into account all the different needs. I mean, maybe, you know, this is going to get a bit technical, but maybe for another conversation. I think one of the challenges today is who is in need in Lebanon? What if you were a middle-class family, but your money is stuck in the bank and you just lost your house? So you don't have access to your little savings left. So I think we really need to think about, you know, so we're talking about 60, 70% of the population. So how do we reach those? How can we go for universality? How do we best spend the money? You know, how much, you know, we're going to have to support rent, but we also need to think about how we bracket and limit rent increases in the country. Same discussions we should have about education. How can we use our, you know, vibrant education, private education system, but also how do we build up a public system? And it's going to be complex, but we need to have these conversations. Now, coming back to this issue of what's the best way to address the social fabric, and I'm also very worried, and I think we all know in Lebanon that the tensions are high. I think the minister also recognized, and I think all of us have seen that really what's keeping things going right now is, in a way, collective wisdom of the people and their desire to ensure that there is no other civil strife. But we know old fears are not far, and Israel has been really poking at them, be it through the attacks, be it sort of, you know, looking at, oh, who's a stranger? Are they going to be a problem? And there's also some legacy of issues from the past where some communities are worried that if the displaced move into their areas, and it looks like maybe this war reconstruction will take longer than 2006, that they will stay. What would that mean? You know, so there are sort of memories and recollections of precedents from the Civil War. So how can we minimize that risk? I think the first one, and the minister alluded to it, people need to feel and see the presence of the state, and there needs to be clear guidance. And I don't mean here just security. Obviously, the army, the internal security forces are important, but that's not enough. We're going to have to be creative in the middle of the crisis, in the middle of what we know has been a weakened state. Can the state deploy social workers to act as local dispute resolution mechanisms? Can the state be visible by actually giving more guidance, again, on things like rents, on security measures for the displaced, like to say no presence of arms, who has access, who's not, ensure that there's no discrimination. There needs to be more guidance. It's not just Syrian refugees, it's also all the migrants, many of them from Africa and South Asia, who have don't know where to go. Their embassies are not necessarily supporting them. So we need that. And right now, because there is a bit of a vacuum, we're seeing some municipalities take the lead, but we're also seeing a return, I don't want to say to sort of old school militias, but a form of self-defense, you know, so communities organize themselves and so forth. And that is, of course, worrisome. We need more state at this point. But the state, we know all its weaknesses, is not going to be enough. And I think here we really need a much more active role of political and religious leadership. I'll start with Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah has a responsibility today, despite all that is actually going through. It needs to kind of send a strong gesture to the rest of the Lebanese population that the policy of the raised finger against fellow Lebanese is over. You know, I think the Lebanese remember May 2008, remember the political assassinations, they remember blocking the port investigation, the beating of October 2019 protesters. They're not in a mood for any revenge, and we're very lucky that I think there's a real collective wisdom here. But I think it's important to have, on the one hand, a gesture from Hezbollah. I think that would ease some of the tensions, but also the Shia community and Hezbollah itself needs assurances from others that they, you know, Hezbollah wants to know that they will not be stabbed in the back, and also the Shia community needs to hear from the rest of the Lebanese community. They're hearing on an individual level, but we need stronger messaging from the political and religious leadership. That, you know, the current moment they're living through doesn't mean that they will be pushed out. how can we be more concrete from that? I would love to see Lebanese politicians meet somewhere, be it in Beirut or maybe in Twotier, a city has been affected, and issue a pledge, a public pledge saying, we collectively commit to this. I think this could reduce some of the tensions and show that they have learned some of the lessons from the past. So I think we need to think of the urgent situation, how to reduce the tension. I think a sort of pledge could perhaps help, could make sure, maybe alleviate some of the anxieties, but also talk a bit about some of the key principles for the day after. Because I think one thing is clear, the Lebanese don't want to go back to the way things were before. We're going to need a new basis for accountability. We're going to need a new basis to make sure that we're not going to go through another May 2008. And that's actually what many of us are afraid is, in Lebanon, usually after each armed conflict, there's a political settlement. And between that armed conflict and the political settlement, there is more uncertainty and more vibrations. No one is talking about the Doha agreement these days. But it took 2 years from 2006, eventually till we get the violence of 2008, then we get the Doha agreement. Can we learn from these lessons? Can we make sure that the current political class, we can hold them accountable? I hope so.
Nadim, on this note, let me just stay with you for a moment, because you're talking about the day after. And one big question is going to be the issue of reconstruction, which will likely also be a very contentious issue. One, we know that reconstruction is unlikely to happen at the speed that it did in 2006. We were all in Beirut in 2006, and I think within a year, most of the destruction had been rebuilt. There was a flood of funding from Gulf countries, from the Europeans, and from many other friends of Lebanon. We're not seeing this enthusiasm today. At the same time, there's a lot of concern that some of the political parties will want to take different bits of this reconstruction under their wing, so to speak. So where do you foresee that most of the reconstruction funding will come from? And, what kind of political conditionalities you think might come in as part of that reconstruction initiatives?
No, not an easy. I mean, we already know Lebanon's economy minister was saying that I think they were estimating that the cost to the country was already 20 billion, and a figure obviously that keeps rising, and that it would take Lebanon, if there was a ceasefire, today, between 3 to 5 years to recover. Now, before we talk about who will pay, I think the more important question is who will reconstruct, with what support and what input from local communities. And I think here, there are a few lessons that we need to remember from the 2006 war. One, at the time, and I think this is why we don't know who's going to pay before we know, before the fighting ends or what the political settlement looks like. Because in 2006, Hezbollah, in a way, managed to use reconstruction to pursue its resistance agenda, not just to Israel, but also to the Lebanese government at the time, which was dominated by the party's political opponents. So in a way, Hezbollah managed to ram through its vision of reconstruction, and that had some pros and some cons. There were also some roles for NGOs and teams of academics, but if you allow me, I want to take a couple of examples that I think are really, really interesting and that we need to start thinking about. How did Hayat Tahrir, what a key part of Dahiya in Beirut, get rebuilt? This Hayat Tahrir hosted around 30,000 people. Hezbollah very early on said, look, the key principle is going to be we go back to the status quo ante. And if you remember, they entrusted Wa'ad, the promise. It was part of Hezbollah's Jihad al-Bina to build it. There was a consulting committee that brought in some professional urban planners. But that was the political project. It was Hezbollah that said, this is how we're going to do it. It allowed it in a way for the process to be more efficient, but it also meant that there was very little discussion about maybe we need to add public spaces. Maybe we need to address long-standing issues around titles and deeds in this area. Can we improve collective space? Can we actually make it so that Dahiya doesn't feel as people talk about it as if somehow it's separate from Beirut, whereas in so many other places it's actually totally connected. So we could have used urban planning to better geographically integrate Dahi into the rest of the city. I don't know what's going to happen this time. I think there's another lesson to be taken, for instance, from Bint Jbeil, and particularly now for places like Nabatieh, where we're seeing the Israelis destroying this beautiful southern town in such a big manner. The way the political economy of reconstruction happened at the time, and if you remember, the government, mostly the political class, encouraged payments basically on the weight of the rubble that was being collected. So there were a lot of things that were destroyed that maybe could have been rebuilt because it was simply more profitable to destroy completely and rebuild. So I think before we talk about who's going to fund, and I'll get to that in a second, we need to think about who's going to rebuild.
Thanks, Nadim. If you say just a few words quickly, because I want to turn to Haneen.
Yeah.
And then maybe some final words from
clearly,
all of you.
I think here, I think just you mentioned what can we do right now, because we know our political class, right? They will try to use any reconstruction to favor their own construction companies, extract surpluses, and so forth. I think here we can see NGOs playing a key role on oversight. There could be lessons drawn from 2006 around urban planning, starting a conversation about how we rebuild with the local communities, giving them voice. I think we can start addressing long-standing issues that are needed, because I think when we rebuild, we need to recognize that Lebanon before the war was already in crisis. So we need to integrate in our reconstruction vision a new economic vision for the country. What is the economic role of Nabatieh? What is the economic role of many of these villages? What is it that we want to preserve? And this has to be done in consultation with people. And I think in the past, we've seen NGOs are good at making sure that these voices are brought up.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, Nadim. I mean, the political economy, I think, of reconstruction, but also participatory approach will be crucial in the coming phase. Haneen, let me turn to you now. And if you can talk a little bit, I know also on education, but on other fronts, you've been following and are involved in many of civil society initiatives. So what role do you see for CSOs in reconstruction efforts and fostering sustainable development in affected areas, but also building on your experience from 2006? What can be learned from that particular experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lebanon is a country almost unique in the region in terms of how active its nonprofit sector is, civil society and NGOs, and for sure want to build on that and take the best of it. I think there's two areas where civil society can be involved in the day after or even from now. The first is on the policy and strategy side, to be a partner with the state in thinking through the day after, the issues, how reconstruction is to be done, and so on. So, and there's several very credible organizations in the country already, in and out the country, who can contribute to this. For example, I mean, even in this Paris conference, I'm not sure if there was Lebanese civil society at the table, like there was in previous conferences. But that's something that would be, and that they obviously can have a watchdog role to play as well. The other, of course, is on actual implementation, and this is a whole different group now of part of civil society, more in the NGOs. And here, while I think they also can do and will contribute and are contributing in terms of the whole humanitarian response and the day after, the role of government here is to have transparent selection criteria, so that there, who is going to help with this and that. So there has to be criteria that NGOs would follow. There has to be transparency, and that way you can get the best of both worlds. And I think I noticed and I understood from Minister Yassin that in Paris, the pledges, basically the method will be going through UN. And I think that's obviously, there's advantage there. International community wants transparency. unfortunately doesn't have the trust in the government. Understand all this, but this keeps repeating itself. In 2006, in 2020, every time there's a crisis, international community says we will not put it through government. We don't trust them. We're not transparent. So we're going to go through UN and NGOs, INGOs, and then NGOs. And of course, there's a very high overhead with this, something like 35%. We all know that. And I see the minister nodding his head. So at some point, this cycle's got to be broken. And from now, we should start the state rebuilding and getting the confidence in the state and building it in the transparent way. But this requires civil service reform. I mean, this is no small thing. And this is what I want to come to in terms of how to move forward the day after. Definitely the government needs to put, or the Lebanese have to find ways to put the state in the driving seat, but it's going to have to be done in a transparent manner. Break this deadlock that we have in the institutions. Of course, it begins with electing a president and a new government and so on. But at this point, this hollowed out state that we have in Lebanon is not going to give confidence to the international community to come and help afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Haneen. Thank you, Nadim. Any last comments? Let me begin with His Excellency, and then I'll move to you and Nadim. Nasser, any last comments, having heard the conversation with Haneen and Nadim?
No, I'm in agreement with a lot of the ideas that Haneen and Nadim have put today. No, I think the central role of the state and public sector is key in all of this. So not to fall back to the same problems we did after the civil war in 2006, after the Beirut blast, is going to be the harder way for everybody. But this is the only way, honestly. And this is what we've been practicing at the level of the in-kind aid we're getting, showing that we can make it and we can be on the driving seat, as Haneen put it. And we've been actually in the driving seat. There are great elements in government and public sector. Not everybody is not to be trusted, and you have to believe in those. I mean, the governors, the mayors, civil servants, they're under-resourced, they're understaffed. Their salary is a couple of hundreds of dollars. I mean, not even for a volunteer in an international organization. And they still go and be in the field, and they work. This is what we are insisting on, but also by practice, not only in the narrative of the Paris paper or in the discussions. Yes, there are issues of trust, but there are issues of trust in all organizations, including non-state actors, including international organizations. So the Beirut blast, the post-Beirut blast operation, and Haneen knows this very well, was actually marred by some of the non-transparent practices by non-governmental actors. So, it's not either or, it's not black and white. I think there are a lot of ways to include the public sector. But of course, Haneen has rightly put it, you need to reform the public sector. You need to digitize the private sector. You need to make it and modernize it to be able to run such an operation. And this operation is not simple. You're talking about billions of dollars that you need to inject into the reconstruction as well as the recovery of the economy. And this is also an opportunity for Lebanon to, for once, make the state at the driving seat and work on it. But I want to and briefly go to what Nadim has mentioned, and they're all great ideas. But the state, since its inception, has failed to create a welfare system. It's has been very residual welfare, charity-oriented, privatized here and there, by design or unintentionally. So now, with one of the most destructive wars on Lebanon and the Lebanese, it's almost theoretical just to think of creating a social protection system and a social welfare system. I'm not against, but just to give you the parameters we're working on. But let's take this, and hopefully the war would stop and we go into the reconstruction and rebuilding and rebuild the state. Rebuilding the state is going to be as challenging as rebuilding the destroyed towns and villages in South Lebanon, in Beirut, and in Beqaa.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Nadim, I know you have to leave very soon, so any last
Sure.
comments?
Yeah,
And
no,
then
thank you
Haneen.
very much. Look, I think all three of us seem to be in full alignment. The real question here is how do we rebuild the state? And actually, how do we densify? Where do we find, I fully agree with Minister Yassin. I mean, where do we find these pockets of excellence so that we can support them? I think the last thing we want is just to have a repeat of just a bunch of UN acronyms running around addressing this and leaving us with nothing. So how do we do it in this particular moment where the state is so weak? That is our collective challenge, but I think it's our collective challenge because we have no other option, because we know all the other options will ultimately fail. And I think we can. I mean, we've seen it on health. We've seen it on parts of relief. The state can play that role where it's actually guiding. It is, we saw it during COVID as well, where I think the Ministry of Health played a key role, guidance using the Lebanese private sector and so forth. NGOs are not the answer to everything. NGOs cannot deliver a political project. They cannot deliver a political vision of what reconstruction of Dahiyya looks like. Because are we going to rebuild Dahiyya to just be so that in 10 years again, we hear again about the stronghold of Hezbollah? No, Dahiyya is our capital, part of our capital. Khalas. I think this needs a political project. Now, the challenge, and I think this is why I'll go back to this idea of a pledge. I know it's probably heretic, but the challenge we have is the current political class. I'm not talking about Minister Yassin. I'm talking about the Zu'ama, the big Zu'ama. The international community has lost faith in them. Why? Because they've known them since the 80s, and they've seen how these guys have run things. So, and yet they are essential right now. But maybe they're essential just to get us to the ceasefire moment, and maybe in their last wave goodbye, they can sort of give some principles that they are not going to use the reconstruction again, just to kind of develop and more their sectarian crony capitalism and so forth. But challenging days ahead. We're going to have to be creative, bold, do more with less, and build a political project. This is perhaps our first war after 2019. Can we show that we've become a different society?
Thank you, Nadim. Haneen, and then I'll
just really, yes, this is a very existential moment for our country. And I think we all need to work together, rise to the occasion, and make sure that for the next generation, maybe not in our lifetime, but in the next, our children's lifetime, there is a better Lebanon. And I think if we listen to them, listen to the youth, listen to their aspirations, what they want from all communities, we'll probably come up with a very good Lebanon. Thank you.
Minister Yassin, Nadim, Haneen, thank you for joining. I think existential challenge, one that we all have to rise to. Are we a different society, one that is able to rise to that challenge? Can we capitalize? Lebanon is a country of tremendous talent, both inside and outside the country. We haven't talked, maybe not for this conversation, but down the road, about the role of the Lebanese diaspora. Incredibly talented and resourceful. How can we pull those resources in, their networks, to really pull Lebanon out of its current quagmire, but also pave for a much better future? Thank you, all of us, all of you, for joining. Thank you to the audience for joining us. Until the next conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.